Hello everybody and welcome back to What If Shadow of War Was Good. If you haven't seen the first two parts, I recommend going back to them or else you're going to be lost for a few different reasons, but chief among them being the framing for my rather flammable video title. Seriously, without context, this won't make any sense. Also, once again, this is just some fun, speculative fanfiction, don't take it too seriously. Also, hi, I'm Bufar191, and that weird sound that you hear in the background? Well, I'm no longer in my dorm, so bear with me. It is the year 2000 of the Third Age. The three kingdoms of Arnor have fallen. Gondor is under siege by men who hail from the east, and the Nazgul have returned to Mordor. Atop Minas Ithil, our hero Talion awaits the end of a city, which, much like him, is damned to fall. Unlike the previous parts, this will be the most story-centered. However, gameplay elements will be mentioned whenever relevant. The reason for this is due to the nature of this entry. It's the ending of Talion's tale, and the beginning of a story many of us know, The Lord of the Rings. There's a lot of loose ends which need to be tied up, so let's get right into it. The game will start in the year 2000 of the Third Age, as I already mentioned before. However, the bulk of the content will transpire in between the years of 2945 and 2951 of the Third Age. That chunk of time being the gap from when Sauron secretly returns to Mordor and when he declares himself openly. Basically, it's the timeline of Shadow of Mordor and Shadow of War proper, which I kind of find interesting. For the past 2,000 years, Talion has resided in Minas Ithil, protecting the city and the Ithil Stone. This is one of the Seeing Stones, or Palantir as they're referred to. The ring has taken its toll on Talion, and by the time the game begins, he is little more than a set of floating robes. Essentially, so much of Talion has entered the Wraith world that very little of him physically remains. This could tie into a difficulty feature where the player has only a limited amount of deaths, or only one death, before they get a game over. Despite Talion's disposition and the trouble the last descending kingdom of Numenor finds itself in, this is perhaps the most peaceful Talion's life has ever been. Excluding trips and missions to combat the forces of evil, Talion has resided in Minas Ithil since the dawn of the Third Age, acting as the city's undead Batman, a task which he isn't alone in doing. Due to their previous adventures and being kindred spirits, the Teleri, a female elf companion who I mentioned in the second part, is there with Talion, a companion who could also be more depending upon the player's choices in the previous game, however that isn't relevant for the time being. Beyond that, Talion also has the company of the city's garrison, a garrison which views Talion as both a terrifying mythical figure as well as a wise mentor. Basically, over the generations in which Talion has watched over the city, he has grown many relationships with those he's served with. The first part of the game would be rather peaceful as you explore Minas Ithil, catch up with what Talion has been doing, and go through a gradual tutorial that reintroduces the fundamental gameplay aspects which have persisted since the first game. Naturally, this peace doesn't last, and Minas Ithil is attacked by a vast army which is under the command of the Nazgul. Talion tells the Teleri to flee and wait for him in Dorwinion, a land of men known for its wine which is located around here. He tells her to do this because he knows the garrison can't hold out, and it's only a matter of time before the city falls. This then leads to a series of fights which reintroduce the combat and large-scale battle mechanics of the previous games. After those battles, Talion realizes the city is lost and attempts to flee with the Ithil Stone to ensure Sauron never gets his hands on it. Like the previous game, this final segment is one that is going to result in a catastrophic death. A death which will take time for Talion to recover from. And also like the previous game, this death can come in a few different forms. With the stone on him, Talion attempts to leave Minas Ithil but is attacked by a Nazgul. If Talion defeats this Nazgul, then 3 more show up. If they're defeated, then the final 4 arrive, keeping in mind that Talion is technically the 9th. If the player is able to defeat all of the Nazgul, he is able to leave the tower, but then finds himself surrounded by a massive army of orcs. This leads to a gauntlet where Talion fends off waves of increasingly difficult enemies. If Talion is able to kill everyone sent his way, then the army orders the orcs to pull back, form ranks, and they pelt him to death with arrows like that scene in 300. This finally kills Talion. However, if the player had a full health bar by the time of the arrow volley, then he doesn't die immediately. Instead, this leads to a scene where Talion rushes into the army, kills even more orcs before finally being riddled to death with arrows by an enemy who is too terrified to care about friendly fire. This segment is meant to illustrate how much of a badass Talion is, as well as reward skilled players with a satisfying end to a part they have to lose. After this battle, centuries pass, and Talion finally reawakens in Dorwinion with the objective to find the Teleri, an objective which is rather straightforward. Now, Dorwinion exists. We know this due to the references made about their wine. However, beyond that, there is very little information about it. This means that the game can do whatever it wants with the region, within reason. Basically, we have a place we can explore and play in where our choices matter because it isn't directly tied into any really major events. Talion finds the Teleri in the kingdom's capital city, and we're brought up to speed on the current state of the world, that being the Men of the East are mobilizing, and the dark forces have begun to flock to Mordor. Also during this conversation, Talion and the Teleri explain that this wait in between deaths is the largest one yet, almost 1,000 years. If Talion dies like that again, he is most likely going to fall to Sauron's will. Talion senses the end drawing near, not just for him, but for all of Middle-earth. His countless years of life have resulted in him being able to see patterns which tend to repeat themselves. The elves are leaving Middle-earth, the dwarven kingdoms are either stagnant or dwindling, and the forces of evil are mobilizing once again. A war is coming, and Talion is going to need an army. Alongside the Teleri, Talion sets off for the wastelands of the north in order to find the orcs he fought beside so long ago. This will be the last part of the prologue and reintroduces the orc recruitment mechanic once the pair reach the civilization which has been built in the far north. In the last game, through interactions with Ratbag, and overall what one can extrapolate from how the Wasteland orcs, the good orcs, look as well as interact, the player could get a feel for what their culture was like. However, during this segment, the player can actually see and experience what the civilization he helped form is truly like. Due to the harsh conditions of the far north, the civilization is nomadic, and made up of separate clans which come together when called. Talion learns of this after finding and venturing to the only true city the orcs have built after speaking with their leader who bears the mantle of the White Rat. To summarize a basic idea, the forces of Sauron have been trying for thousands of years to wipe out the orcs who have existed in defiance of him. These orcs have held them back, however they are on the decline. When Talion convinces, basically the recruitment tutorial, the White Rat to follow him, the clans are assembled and their army marches south through the lands of the east, which are just off the map of Middle-earth. The reason for doing this, other than following a figure who is central to their mythology, is to defeat the great enemy who wants them destroyed. Should note that there are those who stay behind in the north, ensuring a continued survival of the species. When the army finally reaches the game world, the first act and the game proper begins. The game world will consist of 3 very distinct zones. First, there's Mordor, which will be where your orc army combats the forces of Sauron. Much like the second game, this is where the bulk of the fortress battles and fights with war chiefs will go down. Basically, this area is a war zone and is lacking in major story-driven side quests. The second zone will be Dorwinion and the remnants of Rehovian, which is where the bulk of the adventuring and side quests will be due to the civilized nature of the region. Much like the previous games, your actions and choices in this zone will greatly impact the rest of the world as well as your army's strength. The third and final zone will be the Lands of the East, or at least the beginning of the Lands of the East. This place is a mixture of the 2 zones, however the war chiefs you'd be fighting are men, something that hits Talion hard during interactions and cutscenes. This mixture of side quests and warfare melds together and often forces Talion to come to grips with the fact that he is combating men, ordinary men, who have fallen to Sauron. At least that's what he thinks at first. Eventually Talion realizes that most of the men he comes face to face with are just men following orders. They are no more evil than the soldiers who were garrisoned at Minas Ithil or the orcs who fight by his side. A big focus of this zone is turning back the darkness and inspiring the people of the East to take up arms against a master who wishes to see them in chains. even if it is ultimately in vain, because you're only influencing a tiny amount of the people of Rue. They're just a tiny drop in the bucket. Whatever you achieve will be undone by the time of the Lord of the Rings. Details about the plot itself are fairly difficult, since the big idea with this series is to create an authentic Middle-earth world for people to play in. Essentially, the story can be summarized as this: Talion raises an army to defeat Sauron before he becomes a threat to the people of Middle-earth, but he fails and falls to the power of the ring, which has kept him alive for so long. There are a few beats to go over, but that's the long and short of it. I will state, however, the format of a game like this cannot be something like Assassin's Creed Odyssey, with its absurd amount of grind. It cannot be as wide as an ocean, but as deep as a puddle. Just some design philosophy to keep in mind. So with that in mind, most of the story comes in the form of side quests you undertake while exploring this part of Middle-earth, and building your army for your final throwdown with Sauron. Said side quests will tie back into the story. Let's say you're able to get the maximum amount of Easterlings you can to join your side. Their leader may be fighting side by side with you at the final battle, as opposed to against you. It's things like that which should be happening. The line between main story and side quest should be blurred, if outright non-existent. With that said, a few points I want to cover. The first is companions. I don't have any examples of new ones at the moment, however, they will be there. With that said, the Teleri and the White Rat will be companions and are critical to the story. Do want to note that you can still go it alone, just throwing that out there. This time around, Talion's relationship with the Teleri varies depending upon the previous game. However, the core idea is the underlying sense of finality both of the characters feel about the coming conflict. They've been through a lot, and it shows during each interaction. The White Rat, on the other hand, has an underlying sense of hope for the future, of looking forward. The White Rat understands he and the orcs who came south with Talion are most likely going to die, but by doing so, they help ensure a future for the people Talion helped create. Beyond that, you also get general interactions related to their personalities. However, these are the thoughts which occupy the characters' minds. Like the previous games, there's a hidden gauge which can be summarized thusly: the more you do and what choices you make determine how strong you are at the end. Most of the main quests involve Talion creating a path to Mordor and attacking it from its exposed eastern side. This place right here. When the gauge reaches a certain threshold and enough story missions have been completed, Talion will get a prompt to begin the final battle. This is a battle that the player is destined to lose. There is only ever one outcome. However, there are variations. Let's say you go into battle with the minimum requirements. You do damage to Sauron's army, however, he is able to quickly recover it, and begins his assault on Gondor. At the extreme end, if you attack Sauron with your full might, a massive battle unfolds, which cripples Sauron right up until the War of the Ring, with implications that this battle aided in the Fellowship's desperate gamble at the Black Gate. Basically, if you attack Sauron half-cocked, he doesn't commit everything to stop you, only enough. However, if you bring down your full strength upon him, he has to respond in kind. The final battle should be absurdly epic, especially for those who put in the time to build up to full strength. The way I imagine the final battle ending is thusly. After a ridiculously bloody fight, Talion, his companions, his war chiefs, and a handful of orcs and Easterlings are all that is left. The player has to fight through a gauntlet of growing difficulty until they are finally killed, or the orcs are forced to pelt you to death with arrows. As is tradition, the longer you hold, the more epic the final cutscene. However, the final scene of this battle ends with Talion and his closest companions saying their farewells as they finally succumb to their injuries. There's an extra scene for players who choose to pursue a relationship with specific characters, just something I want to note. Not long after, we see a scene of Talion finally joining the ranks of the Nazgul. With that said, we then jump ahead about 70 years to a forested road. Talion, now veiled in black, is prompted to investigate a strange smell which is coming from some foliage. However, as the player attempts to do said investigation, the controls begin to become unresponsive, leading to them outright not working. Not long after, we hear Talion's voice shout, "Run," resulting in a branch catching the camera's attention, leading to the Nazgul fleeing the scene. This is a reference to the books and movies, where Frodo is hiding from a Nazgul who is trying to sniff him out. What this scene is meant to illustrate is that the Nazgul from that point in the book is Talion, and that said Nazgul actually figured out where Frodo was. However, he didn't act upon it because Talion was able to resist Sauron's control long enough to shift his attention away from Frodo. Basically, this is to show that Talion never stopped fighting Sauron's control, even if what he could do was, in the grand scheme of things, very minimal. Past that point, the game finally ends with the destruction of the ring and Talion's final death. However, there's a bit more. Talion awakens upon the banks of the Gwathlo, wearing his Númenórean garb from the first game, with the Teleri standing over him, smiling. While guiding Talion's hand to his chest, she tells him that this is his reward for several millennia of sacrifice. As his heart begins to beat, she tells him that he's been given a chance to live a real life, and that if he so chooses, there's a ship waiting for him at the end of it. With the sun shining high above him, Talion gets up and takes the first steps of his new life in an age he helped make possible. The idea here is that the Valar rewarded Talion with a second chance at life for two reasons. The first is due to the fact he was so young when he put on the ring, which forever damned him. He never really had a chance to live a normal life. The second, however, is due to Talion's reason for wearing the ring. At first he didn't understand what it was, but then when he did, he kept it on despite the risks for purely selfless reasons. He wanted to protect the people of Middle-earth, as opposed to the other 8 Nazgul who used the rings for selfish reasons. The Valar saw a noble man give a great sacrifice for the good of everyone else. They weren't about to damn him for that. Past that, Talion is also given the option to sail the Valinor before his life ends on Middle-earth due to being a ring bearer. The ending is supposed to be a very happy send-off for a character that most players would have hopefully invested a lot of time into. It's meant to be satisfying and conclusive, a good way to wrap up a long journey, both for the character as well as the player. To wrap this up, I want to go over something I neglected to mention: Talion's character. Unlike the last game, where he had to come to terms with a lot of things, this go-round he's fairly entrenched with who he is. Like Geralt from The Witcher 3, Talion isn't going to have any major changes to his character. But that said, the player is still able to make several choices which alter the story as well as Talion. However, they aren't going to be as substantial as the previous games, because again, Talion is well over 3,000 to 4,000 years old. One thing, however, that will be prevalent is a lingering sense of finality and inevitability. He knows that he's going to lose his Battle of Wales against Sauron soon, so he dedicates what time he has left to protecting the people of Middle-earth and trying to make the planet a better place. So guys, that is all I have for you. I hope you've enjoyed this series. It's been an interesting time. Sorry for the long gap and delay. School and finals. Oh man, that's the hard shit. But yeah, I should have gotten this out before the end of the year, so hooray. Peek behind the curtain for those who have still lingered. The song that plays during like the final scene in Shadow of War, that is actually what kind of inspired this, because seeing that scene and hearing that song in Shadow of War felt really unsatisfying. Like, the song itself was great, the scene itself was great, but then I thought back upon Talion and the character and how it made a mockery of the Lord of the Rings, universe. So one thing led to another, and I'm like, you know what? Fuck it. Let's make something that's deserving of that song. At least that was the mindset that led to this. But yeah. So, I've been Boofar191. I hope you've enjoyed this video. Tell me what you thought in the comments down below. I'll see all of you next time. Goodbye.